Blame HUD for America's Lead Epidemic by Emily Benfer. New York Times, March 4th, 2016. Since news first emerged last year about dangerously high levels of lead in the drinking water in Flint, Michigan, it has become shockingly clear that the city is far from alone. Reports of lead poisoning are on the rise across the country, from New York to Ohio and Iowa, particularly among low-income and minority children. Not all of the cases involve tainted water supplies. In many cases, the blame lies somewhere else entirely. Federal housing policies in place since the 1990s that have placed 1.6 million households with children at risk for lead poisoning. The problem is a dangerous mismatch between the prevailing science on lead poisoning and the Department of Housing and Urban Development standards. These outdated regulations set the blood lead level for lead poisoning 3 to 4 times higher than that set by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. While the CDC recommends intervention for lead poisoning at 5 micrograms per deciliter, HUD regulations do not call for action until after a child's lead level is 20 micrograms per deciliter, or 15 to 19 micrograms per deciliter over 3 months, levels that cause severe and permanent brain damage. These regulations are the most egregious contributors to the epidemic of lead poisoning in public and low-income housing. I have spent 6 years working with Loyola University Chicago law students, the Erie Family Health Center, and civil legal aid organizations on cases involving low-income families living in unhealthy housing. We have seen firsthand how chipping, cracking lead paint creates a toxic living condition. Many landlords make the problem worse by ignoring federal and local laws and making repairs and renovations that disperse poisonous dust in the air, or simply evicting the problem tenants who complain. A result is that hundreds of low-income Chicago children in federally subsidized housing have been poisoned in the past few years. Until recently, the Chicago Housing Authority routinely denied requests from low-income families to move out of lead-hazardous homes. In doing so, it did not break any rules. It merely followed federal guidelines. Take the case of 4-year-old Mahogany Walker. When her blood lead levels started to rise, her family applied for a transfer. But the Housing Authority rejected the application, saying she had yet to reach the HUD threshold. Like most people at risk of lead poisoning, the Walker family did not have the resources to hire a lawyer. But Mahogany's mother, Lenice Walker, contacted our team, and together we compelled the Housing Authority to grant her request for a safe place to live. To its credit, Chicago has since committed to align its own guidelines to the CDC's. Yet many public housing authorities across the country have yet to follow suit. The effects of lead poisoning on Miss Walker's children and countless others are irreversible. To stand by as children's ability to flourish is destroyed is unpardonable. For that reason, a coalition of civil legal aid groups, medical providers, and public health experts have filed a petition with the HUD urging critical amendments to its lead poisoning prevention regulations. Our proposed changes would align federal regulations with the CDC's standards and the prevailing science to ensure that a lead hazard is identified before a child moves into a federally subsidized housing unit. New legislation, co-sponsored by Senator Richard J. Durbin, Democrat of Illinois, and Senator Robert Menendez, Democrat of New Jersey, would require these recommendations for all federally subsidized housing, including through the federal voucher program. If we do not commit to solving this problem, we will continue to accrue the staggering costs associated with lead poisoning. Up to $53 billion in medical care, $233 billion in lost lifetime earnings, $35 billion in lost tax revenue, and $146 million in special education expenses, as well as $1.7 billion in direct costs of increased crime associated with higher levels of lead in a community. Of course, the problem goes beyond federally supported housing. Countless families in the private rental market are exposed to lead hazards and are clustered in communities at high risk for lead poisoning. This problem is complex, and all of us have a role to play if we're going to find a meaningful solution. When local public health departments fail to enforce existing regulations, or those regulations are not strong enough, we must ensure that families with limited resources have access to civil legal aid and law school clinics so they are not trapped in life-threatening conditions. The tragedy in Flint and communities across the nation is a stark reminder that lead poisoning remains an unrelenting threat to our children's health and futures. The question is whether we as a country are up to the challenge of ending the scourge once and for all.